I don't know how many of you saw the Bruce Springsteen commercial, the Jeep commercial during the Super Bowl. I was watching for it, looking for it. I'm a huge Springsteen fan. I think his 50-year career is remarkable. I think his, songs are just incredible. His latest recording, Letter to You, which is really about loss and death and meaning, I think is just his most stunning work. And of course, I really appreciate his political passions. He's always been a big advocate of racial and economic justice and equality for all Americans, and he does not do commercials. Jeep had been after him to do this for several years. And supposedly, just at the very last minute, a few days before the Super Bowl, he agreed to do it because he believed in the theme, the reunited states of America. And if you saw it, it was sort of vintage Jeep commercial. It was those grand vistas of the country and kind of the iconic little coffee shop. It made the middle of Kansas in February look so beautiful, you wanted to go there, right? And in it all, Springsteen's voice calling us to the middle, calling us to a place he said was really hard to get to, the middle of this country, literally the middle of this country, Lebanon, Kansas, a little chapel that stands there. And as Springsteen said, it's always open and everyone is always welcome. And he said, the middle is not a place we've been able to get to lately. We're so divided, right, between red and blue and between our fear and our freedom. But he said, we can get there. We can get up to the top of the mountain. We can make our way through the desert. We can cross the divide. We can come back together. We can be the reunited states of America. Yeah, well, maybe he was a little too optimistic because the commercial was panned, right? People on the right said, why'd you choose a liberal icon like Springsteen to talk about the middle? I'm not listening. And people on the left said, what was up with all those crosses? Man, this is a pluralistic country. Jew and Christian and Muslim and people of no faith, and there were crosses. It was just this nationalistic thing. But there were people who loved it. I had colleagues who sent it out that next morning to their congregations. A really dear friend, PhD, brilliant. And she said, I grew up in a home, my father loved football, season tickets to the Bears. I've never cared for it, but that was an incredible commercial. That's what I try to preach. That's what I heard growing up in my home. That's what I try to share all the time. And she wasn't the only one. And she's a rabbi, and her significant other, a rabbi, wrote an article about it in the newspaper in Israel, just praising it. They looked past that cross on top of the American flag, the country, which, believe me, I could have lived without. But I gave Springsteen the benefit of the doubt, and they did too, because I know his career too much and too deeply. The guy's not making a recruitment tool for the Proud Boys. And I know kind of his life story, how he grew up in this small town in New Jersey. His father was a drunk. His father was a mean drunk. His father was schizophrenic. His mother was really the breadwinner. A lot of tension. A lot of tension in his town, right? Racial tension. He sings about that. A lot of fights between the black and whites in my hometown. All this, he just lays out the brokenness in our own lives and in our world. But there's also that other thing that's so deeply a part of him, even though he's not a practicing Catholic, he has that church so deeply in him. And he talks about that, how his whole life, the church was just right there across the street, just, and the funerals and the wakes and the baptisms. And in it all, I see Mary in the garden, right? How he sings and calls us to rise up, how there's this God who is right there with us in our suffering. I mean, for Springsteen, that's what the cross is. It's God with us in our suffering. That is not to say that the cross has not been used and misused as a tool of brutal torture. When I lived in South Africa in 2006, I mean, it's one thing to kind of know the history, to know that, 400 years ago, the British and the Dutch and the French and the Germans and Spain, they all came to the country, to that continent, to the part, southern Africa, and they made their way up through that continent and they chopped that country up and they took the cross first. It was the missionaries who carved it up before the military, because once they had claimed that country for Christ, they could go along and claim it for the crown. And we've seen the exact same thing happen in this country, right? The conquerors who came, the slaveholders who justified slavery, telling the slaves, hand picking those scriptures in there about slaves being obedient to their masters, just just justifying the most vile brutality. If you watched any of the PBS special on the Black church in America, one theme you could not miss, especially in the first part, was how much the slave owners did not want the slaves to read. I mean, it was a crime. You could go to prison because they didn't want the slaves to read the story of Moses, right? They didn't want the slaves to know how Moses cried out to God, and God held back the Red Sea, and the slaves traveled through to Promised Land. The slaves didn't want the slaves, to hear Jesus saying, you know, God has called me to preach good news to the poor and release to the captives and liberty to the oppressed. The slave owners thought, we just don't want them to read and they won't know it. Yeah, they didn't need to read. All they had to do was see the cross, right? To understand that Jesus was with them, to understand that Jesus had laid on that cross, his back broken open with the whips, his hands and feet bowed. I mean, the slaves got it. They understood that the central message of the cross is that Jesus suffers with us. God suffers with us, and there's no denying that. And the message, of course, in our lesson is not so much, Jesus doesn't say to the disciples, go out and understand the cross. He says to them, go out and take up the cross. But not just the cross or a cross. He says, take up your cross, their cross. He tells us all that we have to find the suffering we know, the suffering we've experienced, and use that. I hadn't ever really heard it that way. And again, I heard that from Matt Meyer Bolton this week. Like, what is your cross? Like, what is the suffering you've experienced? For me, 9 years ago, I lost my life. I lost 21 years of my life, lost marriage, lost career. Others of you, your cross is addiction. Some of you, it's anxiety and depression, the kind of depression, that kind of suicide that just almost drives you to the end. Some of you, it's cancer and a brain tumor. Some of it's infertility. I mean, there's so much. And in the scripture, it's so clear too that Jesus is primarily standing with the people cast out and despised. He's standing with those 62 million Americans who don't earn a living wage, who have to struggle to live, to have food, to be able to take care of their children, to provide health care. So what we're told in all of this is that we're called somehow to take up our cross and somehow make it into some gift we can offer to other people. Danielle Ponder took up her cross when she was 16. When she was 16, two things happened to her. Her father gave her a guitar, and looking back on it, that guitar had like 4 strings and it was out of tune, but she was the only little black girl in the hood with the guitar, and she just went everywhere singing all the time with that guitar. The other thing that happened, though, was her brother Dwayne. He went to prison that year for a robbery in which no one was injured for 20 years. It was get tough on crime, and the judge's options were 20 years to life. He was everything to her. He taught her to ride a bike. He loved her. He protected her. He played with her. She went everywhere with her brother Dwayne. And just like that, he was gone. And she knew at 16 that her cross would be trying to make it different for others. So she became a public defender. Someday she sees 50 clients, 50. Like the 16-year-old who came in from the holding cell, his hands were bound behind his back and his head was bowed. And he'd been arrested for riding his bike without a bell, gone to jail. Or the 71-year-old who was just sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison for driving on a suspended license. Or the mentally ill, so many mentally ill, just crying and screaming and just so unaware why they just can't go back home. But the one that broke her heart, the one that moved her to sing that beautiful song we heard, Poor Man's Pain, was Willie Simmons. In 1982, Mr. Simmons was sentenced to life in prison for stealing $9. He's been in prison for 40 years for stealing $9. He's exhausted all of his appeals. He's begged and he's pleaded to get his life back. At some point, Danielle Ponder decided being a public defender ain't enough. I got to take my voice out there onto the stage. I got to get in front of other people. I got to take that up. And then, after she's toured internationally and toured all over, COVID shut it all down. And then, of course, George Floyd brought it into our homes, what this country is. And she took that microphone and put it down and picked up that megaphone and started leading the Black Lives Matter movement in Rochester. I can't sing like Danielle Ponder. I can't sing like Bruce Springsteen. I can't sing like Ellie or Alex or John. I can't sing at all, right? Not at all. But I have got suffering. And I lost a job I loved. I lost a lot. And I've been able to take that and use that. And I've been able to offer it up. But until I heard that word this week about take up your cross, I don't think I realized what a gift that could be. I wasn't looking for the president's speech Monday night. I didn't even know. I knew we were closing in on 500,000 deaths from COVID, but I didn't know there was going to be a ceremony. I'd gotten up on the exercise bike and turned NPR on. And then I heard the president speaking, realized it was live, so I turned the TV on. Some of you may have seen it, seen the pictures of the White House. So beautiful, so holy, with those candles lit, marking the lives of those beautiful Americans we lost. And the speech, I mean, as presidential speeches go, it wasn't the Gettysburg Address. It was kind of vintage Biden. He tripped over his words some. He stuttered maybe a little bit more than we've heard lately. He started off by talking about each morning he gets 2 cards in his pocket. One is the schedule and one is the number we've lost to COVID. And he looked at it that Monday night and it said 500,071. 71. And you could tell every one of those people mattered to him. And he began to say, we can't let these people become a statistic. We can't become numb to this. Every single one of these people was an extraordinary American. Read the obituaries, he said. You know, there was the son who called his mother every single night. And there was the best friend who was always there for you. And there was the nurse who was so encouraging, who did every single thing she could to help her patients get better. And he said, I know it is so hard. And you know, he was telling the truth, right? He lost his wife and his 1-year-old daughter right before he became a U.S. Senator. And of course, he lost Bo, great American, to brain cancer. He said, I know it's so hard, but you have to remember the way they smelled in the closet, the cup of coffee in the morning, the movie where you met for the first time. You've got to remember because it's how we heal. And he said, it's been so hard this year with our rituals taken away. But you have to remember, and I promise you the day will come The day will come when you'll think of them and the smile will come to your face before the tear to your eye. And that's when you know you're on your way. But then he said, you got to remember too, and you got to take it and you got to create a life of purpose. You've got to ask yourself, am I living in a way that the person I lost would be proud of me? A life worthy of their life that's been lost, a life worthy of this country, a life worthy of our faith. By this time, I was off the exercise bike and I was just sobbing, just sobbing. I know I've joked about how I cried, but I lost some people this year, and I'm not proud to say it, but I didn't cry at all. 30 years, I knew someone, and I just couldn't even feel a thing. And I just listened to the president Monday night, and I just sobbed. You know, the kind of sobbing where your whole body shakes and shakes, and the tears just ran. And then I rewound it, and I watched it again, and I just cried. And then I went up and I told Joe, everyone needs to hear this. We all have to grieve, not so we will stay there, right? But so we will take up that hurt and use it to create something new, some joy, some justice, some freedom, some beauty, some resurrection hope. That's what we're called to do, all of us, to sing with Springsteen and Biden and Danielle Ponder, to sing of the hope and the love and the joy and the freedom that God is bringing to us. Amen.